The problem with IQ is that it tends to label people and make them think that they have either some qualities or they don't have some qualities. We identify quote-unquote gifted children and then track them and give them good teachers and intense curriculum, and we create a divergence in their behavior, in their performance. And so the idea is, genius is a label that is a retrospective judgment about an individual. It's something we look back and say, that person is a genius, but it's a retrospective judgment. It's really a prospective judgment. But my real question is, what do we gain by adding the label of genius to people who achieve great things? What do we gain? I have just this year become a new grandfather. So I do the grandfather things, like showing pictures of my new grandson and my daughter. Anyway, thank you so much. It's a lovely morning in Cleveland. And when Thomas asked me to do this talk on genius, my first concern was that I didn't really know much about it, the topic, and I didn't consider myself expert on it. Basically, so when he asked me, I said, I really don't think I'm an expert on this, but then later on I thought, what the hell? Not knowing about something hasn't prevented me from talking about it in the past, and if you're a teacher, you do this all the time. So why stop now? Now that I'm retired, I'll just continue the practice. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And it's a good excuse to learn something new about a new area that you haven't really studied in great depth. Of course, genius means many things to many people, and not always in a complimentary way. For example, we know about all the people, the financial wizards who develop these exotic instruments like derivatives and credit default swaps that tank the housing market. I'm sure they're considered financial geniuses, okay, in their own world. But the consequences were not that good for everybody else. So let's look at what we mean by the word genius. We all have some sort of intuitive idea of what genius is. And we tend to reserve the label, this is my intuitive idea, we tend to reserve the label genius for those few people who have rare cognitive and creative qualities that enable them to achieve things that we think are beyond us, even if we were to spend our whole lives trying with undivided attention and effort. That's an intuitive notion. The problem arises with almost everything when you try to make it more concrete and specific. We run into something called the demarcation problem, which is when you try to make a definition of something, we find it hard to define things in such a way that only the things that we think belong are accepted by the definition, and the things that we think shouldn't belong are excluded. For example, if we start with definitions of genius, it is impossible to arrive at a definition that includes only the people who we think belong as geniuses and excludes all those who don't belong. On the other hand, we can start with the concrete. Make a list of all the people we think are geniuses, and then see if there's any common factors that are associated with all those that we can extract and say, these are the marks of genius. But trying to do that with almost anything is difficult. For example, if you ask how do you define what a dog is? It's very hard to define a dog such that only dogs belong in that definition and cats are excluded, for example, or other animals. Try it. So but children, for example, learn what a dog is without any definitions. After a little while, they know exactly what is a dog and what is not a dog, because there is some sort of family resemblance that they have. And that's the best we can hope, is for a rough match between what we think of as defined as an entity and what we actually think belongs as that entity. So now I'm going to first start with the concrete. I'm going to give you some images of people, And I want you to tell me if you think they are geniuses. Those people in the back may not be able to see these images. You may want to move and see that. But I'll put them up, and maybe the best way is clap if you think they are a genius. Yeah, Einstein is like the gold standard. Okay, so 0 to 10, he's the 11. Okay, and so we'll use him as a baseline, and you don't even have to tell his name, everyone knows it. Isaac Newton. Okay. Genius. Charles Darwin. All right, good. Leonard Euler. Nope. Exceptionally gifted mathematician. Incredible. Died in the 1800s. Okay, that's Euler. So maybe but he's among mathematicians, he would be considered a genius. David Hilbert, German mathematician, considered a genius by mathematicians, but nobody else knows it. Somebody mentioned Ramanujan, the Indian mathematician. Okay, died at an early age, considered by mathematicians to be a genius. Nobody knows outside mathematics, very few. What about this guy? We go to another field. Shakespeare. Mozart. Bach. Picasso. Yeah. Claude Monet. We are a crowd that's very familiar with the arts and the humanities. Good. Another Beethoven, very recognizable. So these are people, I think most of the people that we got here, except the mathematicians who are not known to most people, were considered geniuses. Now, note that there was not a single woman in that group, and only one person of color. Okay? And also, the people in that group were scientists, mathematicians, writers, painters, and musicians. And they were all people who lived some time ago, most of them at least a century ago, except for Picasso, for example. So we have the issue of, now let's start from the other way, trying for the definition. So I looked up definitions in dictionaries. Oops. A common usage, Merriam-Webster. What does genius mean? It's a single, strongly marked capacity or aptitude. Extraordinary intellectual power, especially as manifested in creative activity. A person endowed with extraordinary mental superiority, especially a person with a very high IQ. So I looked up the Cambridge Dictionary. It's a very great and rare natural ability or skill, especially in particular areas such as science or art. Oxford English Dictionary, an exceptionally intelligent or talented person, or one with exceptional skill in a particular area of art or science. So these are the 3 dictionary definitions of genius that I looked up. Now, I'm going to take those definitions and I'm going to highlight certain things. So when you look at these definitions, let's ask, what is it that they think genius is? And here you can see the words capacity, aptitude, intellectual power, mental superiority, a very high IQ, a very great and rare ability or skill, intelligent, talented, intellectual, creative, imaginative, thought. So those are the words that seem to jump out when you ask yourself, what exactly is genius? Trying to extract those common things. So where is it observed? It's observed in creative activity. We find it in science or art. And again, in the Oxford is art and science. Again, art and science. And in invention or discovery. Those seem to be the areas where we think genius manifests itself. Okay? Notice that we don't see it in other areas like history or economics and so on. And that's an interesting question. Why is it? Is it that people who are geniuses don't go into those areas? Seems highly unlikely. It's likely that we have reserved the label for a particular narrow subset of creative work. So how is it acquired? we see capacity or aptitude, all these highlighted words seem to imply that we are born with it. So we say a person endowed with an extraordinary mental superiority. High IQ, which is another thing that people think is a source one has at birth. That's a debatable, the whole issue of IQ is very debatable. But anyway, it seems people associate that with genius. Again, a natural ability or skill, innate intellectual or creative power, instinctive. All these seem to imply that we somehow either have it or we don't have it. So let's look at it a little bit more closely. Can genius be predicted later in life? Is being a child prodigy an indicator of genius? So Calvin says, I'm so smart it's almost scary. I guess I'm a child progeny. And Hobbes says, most children are. And Calvin says, huh? And Hobbes says, nothing. And Calvin says, people think it must be fun to be a super genius, but they don't realize how hard it is to put up with all the idiots in the world. And then Hobbes says, isn't your pants zipper supposed to be in the front? Okay. So, can genius be measured? Is very high IQ, for example, a sign of genius? Now, this IQ is, for me, a very problematic concept. I grew up in Sri Lanka. We didn't do IQ testing of children. And it was kind of a shock to me when I came to the US how much IQ plays in the thinking of people. I'm curious, how many of you have had your IQ measured? I don't want to know the score, just had it measured. Quite a few. How many? Okay. My children were, when they grew up here, of course, they had their test measured. I didn't want to know the scores. I still don't know their scores because I don't think it's a useful concept. In general, people think that you have to have an IQ of greater than 125 to be considered a genius. But the problem with IQ is that it tends to label people and make them think that they have either some qualities or they don't have some qualities. And for example, in Sri Lanka, when we didn't have IQ, but people would check, for example, to see whether you were in language, especially whether you were advanced in language or behind. And what they would do with the students who were advanced in language is they would separate them out and give them the worst teachers. Because they figured these people know the language, it doesn't matter what you do to them, they're fine. The people who need help are the students who have difficulties. Whereas here we seem to do the opposite. We identify quote-unquote gifted children and then track them and give them good teachers and intense curriculum, and we create a divergence in their behavior, in their performance. Whereas there, the tendency was to say, these people need help. And in fact, Alfred Binet, the originator of the IQ test, didn't define it to measure intelligence. He invented the test to identify who are the students who are not meeting benchmark expectations at their age level, and in order that they could be taught specially to bring them up to the age level. It was not meant to be a measure of innate intellectual ability. But once it came to the US and became mass-produced, it became seen as a measure of innate intellectual ability. And in fact, Binet, there's a story that he came to America, or maybe it was somewhere, he gave this talk about IQ, and people said, now that you have figured out how to measure this IQ, how can we use it to make children learn faster and better? And Binet is supposed to have sighed and said, ah, yes, the American question. Because that's how we see these things. So, is genius can be measured? Is a very high IQ a sign of genius? Is genius innate? Are people born with it, or is it the product of fortuitous circumstances, i.e. having the right environment and experiences at the right time? And my feeling is that it's not necessarily innate. You can always look back and find innate qualities in anybody. When you look back on their childhood, and if somebody turns out to be very productive, you can look back and find qualities that you think, oh, that was a sign that you were going to do this. But there are people who have those signs and don't do anything with it either. Is it a trait carried only by white males? If you look at how the people we label genius, that seems to be what people think. But obviously, it can't be the case. And why are huge areas of knowledge and skills not represented? I have put here The MacArthur Fellows. The MacArthur Foundation doesn't call them geniuses, but the media tends to call them geniuses. And this is how they identify who they think are worthy of their fellowship. Exceptional creativity, promise for future advances based on a track record of significant accomplishment, and the potential for the fellowship to facilitate subsequent creative work. The fellowship is not a lifetime achievement award, but rather an investment in a person's originality, insight, and potential. So the question is, how can one identify originality, insight, and potential without past achievements as a measure? So usually, we think we are measuring something in it, but what we are really looking at is what have people achieved, and can they do more of it? Okay? So the problem, there's a basic problem about the innateness, the concept of an innate genius, and may generate damaging misconceptions about innate cognitive abilities. For example, you may have heard about the recent flap at Google with the engineer who said that he didn't think women had the ability to be good coders. Clearly, he has some idea that that ability is somehow innate and genetic. Okay? And I encountered it all the time when I was teaching physics. Students would come to me and say, I can't really do mathematics and physics. And they would sometimes even say, I don't have the gene for it. And I would ask them, how do you know this? And it's usually some early experience, they found something hard, and they just got turned off, and they went and did something else. There's nothing to say that they could not have done it if they really worked at it. Okay? And I think that's a problem with the idea of innate genius. Is genius a useful concept? So here we have Calvin writing a report. He says, first Calvin. Then he thinks, okay, I'll write it as Calvin the genius. And then in third panel, Calvin the super genius. And Hobbes asks, this is how you sign your reports? And Calvin says, it kind of inclines you to read it more charitably, don't you think? And so the idea is, genius is a label that is a retrospective judgment about an individual. It's something we look back and say, that person is a genius, but it's a retrospective judgment. It's really a prospective judgment. But my real question is, what do we gain by adding the label of genius to people who achieve great things? What have we gained? Do we gain anything by calling Einstein a genius or Mozart a genius, other than to put them on a pedestal? I think there's a problem with that, because I think when we use the word label, or label of genius for these people, we imply that most people do not have those kinds of creative abilities, when I think there's no reason to believe that at all. Okay? I think we are all capable of doing many great things, except that we limit ourselves. We take cues from various educational systems and so on, and think there are some things we can do, some things we can't do. There are some things we can do fairly well, but maybe some people think there's nothing I can do really well, when there's no real reason to think that. Okay? And so I'd like to end by saying, maybe we are all geniuses in some ways. As Calvin says, I'm a genius, but I'm a misunderstood genius. And Hobbes asks, what's misunderstood about you? And Calvin says, nobody thinks I'm a genius. So I think, we might all be geniuses. I really don't think, my personal opinion is, I don't think genius is useful as a concept. I think it's actually harmful, because it creates an idea of innate cognitive and creative ability and discourages people from really working hard to develop whatever interests that they have to become really good at it. Okay? Thank you.